Good morning. So today's Wednesday. We're halfway through, the work week. I mean, technically we'll be halfway around noon, because first half of the day we have passed, and then we have two, full days of work. And I am at a point right now where I seem to be kind of like just really overwhelmed with ideas. I was kind of like talking to my mom yesterday that, like while I'm writing, I'll be, I'm still working on book 3, but I'm like almost at the end. When I'm working on book 4, I will also be working on other things. At least I will try. I mean, book 4 will still be the priority, but like there's going to be some investment. And yesterday, my class yesterday was, it just gave me so many ideas. We were talking about writing, not like writing as you have in a not like creative writing or anything, but like the invention of writing, discovery, you could say, and how it impacted history. How like we said, in terms of like archaeology, how like those are kind of like the things that are relevant to us, and which kind of like we're trying to kind of like perpetrate. Yeah, that's one. And it was pretty interesting, and I had like so many ideas because one of like the novels that I'm writing that I want to write simultaneously with book 4 is one from way back in it's from like some 4 or 5 thousand years ago. Like it's a very different period. And as my professor was, we were talking about it, we're discussing, I kind of like just had idea of like, oh, this is how the system is going to be. Some of the things I had already thought about before, but it was just very conclusive, the way that it was happening. I was very much invested. I was like, okay, so this is how we're going to disseminate information, this is how we're going to make these things clear for everybody, and kind of like also like, for example, like who had access to writing so far, like so far, history. And now like there's an element there of of class, of socioeconomic situations, and how all that like came to play. And I don't know, it's just very interesting. I really enjoyed the class, and it got me with like lots of ideas, so much so that there were little points during the class that I was kind of like thinking I was not really, almost like not paying attention to what was being said because I was in my head developing things. So that was pretty exciting for me. And yeah, so basically I kind of want to work on that. That's this specifically novel, which so far the title is Empire of Lost Souls. It might change, and also like I'm thinking about being kind of like in because it's going to show certain levels of conquest and of like changing the system. So I'm thinking that like the first book, it will get to a certain point, the conquest, and then I could write later on about different like other steps of like this story. But so far I'm settling just for like with book 1, and maybe it's going to be book 1 of something. I think that one could be a trilogy. Like I think that I have a notion of like what like things could be, but like I'm thinking about writing like that one, and then later on when I've written a lot more things, I'll go back to this world because there's a lot of different series I want to start. And I think that the idea of like finishing a series like is very relevant, but I can do both things simultaneously. I can kind of like work on 2 series. So like, let's just wait and see how things are going to get, what's going to be for me. But like suffice to say that right now I'm pretty excited about anything and everything. And also like I think I had so many ideas that I was struggling to write this morning. Like it can be kind of like worrisome because sometimes like when I get like had this many ideas and that it gets in the way of like me actually doing anything, it can be a hint that I'm getting manic. So hopefully like that's not that. Hopefully I'm just doing very well. And as I said, like I'm here because I want to get some stuff out of my system and talk a little bit about things because that will kind of like help me on the long run, and also in the short term it will be helpful because I'm getting stuff out there so I can sit down and write, because that's kind of like what I want. I have like about 40 pages left of like this version like of this draft that I'm doing. So I kind of yes, I want to finish this one, and I'm gonna have another one where I will be polishing everything, and then there'll be a third one where I'll be just kind of like checking if everything is okay. So I'm kind of like close to what to the end, and it's very exciting because, for example, the other day I already dreamt that I had like book 3 in my hands, because I really like going. My parents, they show they display my books at a coffee table in the living room. So you have that plus a table necklace, and I was thinking that I was just pretty much seeing like book 3 being there as well. And I'm so excited. I'm so happy. I'm getting close to kind of like finishing this novel, and I'm really proud of myself for what I produced, which is kind of like one of the best feelings. I feel like I'm doing better than I was before, because perfection is kind of unattainable, but like you have to kind of like grow and develop. So like that's kind of like where I am at right now. I'm seeing like this growth, I'm seeing like this improvement, and it's also pretty fun. It feels great to see this story kind of like developing and this world kind of like expanding. There's a lot of expansion in this novel. You kind of like you see different facets, and this is kind of like like that's the foundation for like everything else I'm gonna write in this world so far, like in the future. And it's interesting because basically I know so far I have like stories that happen in a different world, but as of right now, as of like I guess like the next decade, is all in this world. And I really like when you have multiple series like in the same world, because it just really makes everything like really fleshed out, and it really feels like this world that you can live in. And that is kind of like where I am at with my writing. But something that I wanted to talk about, that I was thinking, because I don't really believe in things. Oi, I'm back. My mom needed the credit card, so but continuing. I was thinking about this. I've been thinking about this for the past couple of days, because I'm not really a believer in anything, but I did grow up in a religious context. And a lot of times when I'm talking about where I am at right now, people think like, what happened that made you stop believing? And for me, it was more like there was a certain build up, and kind of like ended up with me kind of like realizing like, oh, I don't actually think that these things are real, that they're going to happen the way that things have been said, or they will happen at all. And I kind of like got very so yeah, I was thinking, as I said, like I guess like I think of my teenage years and my young adult years and where I was, and all those things. But like something that I that did kind of like break my belief system. I was thinking about very small things when I was growing up. So for example, a very clear classic example that I can give is that when I was little, when I was a kid, I really prayed for my blood to be pink. Pink is my favorite color, and it has always been, and it will kind of like always be. I think at this point, I don't see it changing. And there's so many different shades, and I feel like I might go back and forth in the shade that I'm the most fond of at different points in time. But like it's always the same, constant. And that was something that I prayed fervor. There was a lot of fervor in my prayers, and like it never really happened. It's one of those things that when I say it's kind of like sounds crazy, like why my blood be of a different color, but that was something that when I was a kid I really wanted, and that never really came true. And I think it might have been part of like me kind of like getting to the beginning of like this journey of like me not really believing anything. And I know it sounds kind of silly, but there are some other examples. So for example, I we didn't really had cable. Right now we don't have, we went back to like not having cable anymore, but it's also because everything's on streaming and you can get other platforms, so it's not really necessary. But when I was 8 is when we finally had cable, because when I traveled with my mom, and on the hotel TV like they had cable, and I was very much enthralled. And but like at first it was not like the full package, so there were a lot of like different channels that they didn't really that we didn't really have access to that. But they would do these things every once in a while where they would give you like a little bit, a little taste of it. So those channels, they would be present for a little while. Eventually, I think by the time I was 10, we already had like all the channels, and I consumed it. And then a few years later, I stopped watching stuff on cable, particularly because like there was, I think it was the beginning of like me streaming. It was like there were some TV shows from like the cable channels that I wanted to watch, but like they would take a while to kind of like air here in Brazil. So I would kind of like go online and see them, because at that point my English was already pretty good, so I could understand things. So it was kind of like the beginning of like me just like going online for content. But it was interesting because like in this in between, I remember a couple of times that I was straight up crying. I was praying like, please let this we have access to this channel for a little longer, while longer. And it never really happened. So that was another thing that I remember just made me, I guess like it might have made me feel alone. These are all conjectures, like how I felt about those situations, because just because like you pray for something and you don't have because you don't have a response, then it's no. And people are allowed to say no, so you kind of like, you could argue that like God is also allowed to say no to your prayers. But I think that they were so inconsequential, like there was no moral to that, like they were pretty much just the way they were. So it's kind of like, why did they like why did those prayers not get answered? And I don't know, I was just thinking about these small things from my upbringing, and how I guess like there was already a path was started to be carved from like those situations. Naturally, like you could argue that like they didn't really do anything because it involved. I don't know, like they were, as I said, like they were so inconsequential. They had nothing to do with anything. But I don't know, I was thinking about how, starting there, because I talked about this before, how I was when I was like in sixth grade, when you were like, what, 12, 13. I had, this thought, and, like I feel like I felt like a heretic at the time, because I was just like seeing kind of like how the world was. Because, the other day a pastor came here, to visit us, and basically you're talking about creation, evolution, all that, and how there is, because there is like a theological type of evolutionism that you can that some people believe in which you kind of like believe that things happen the way they are, but like there was an intervention, like the presence of God, that was kind of like allowing things to kind of like happen and change. And that's not what like this pastor believed in, but it made me realize that like, oh, that is what I always believed in. Like that's kind of like how I interpreted the world. And then of course, like I later on, like I changed paths. Like things changed. But that was kind of like, I think that's pretty much why like you had the progression of events the way that they were, because I think if you believe something kind of like extreme, a very kind of like exclusive notion, like it's kind of hard for you to leave that bubble. But if you have something that's already kind of like halfway there, like it's easier for you to believe. And also like we end up having conversations about the existence of God and all that, and it's kind of crazy because I and as I said, like I'm surrounded by religious people, so these conversations they kind of they end up happening quite often, very impromptu for my part, because I feel like when I was younger I would try to kind of like instigate these conversations, but like right now I'm like very much like I believe what I do, I don't believe what I don't, and there's nothing you can say that will change my mind. But it's interesting because people they find belief in different things, so there are different facets of like existence of creation that they attach themselves to. So I know whenever I feel like the past few months, like whenever I do have a conversation like this with it's usually Christians. There are other religions out there, but like that is pretty much what like where I am at. It's like Christianity very prominent, very, I think that like 80 or 90, like 90% of the population is some type of Christian, and even like the other religions, they kind of like still believe in a lot of like the things that they're being said like in the Bible and all that. So like so that is kind of like it is my experience. But it's interesting because like people they try to offer you kind of like proof, but it's never really proof, because also like I think that one of the reasons that I struggle to believe in what I read is because like those things they don't happen. So for example, I gave this example the other day when the pastor was here, that for example turning water into wine, like when has ever it happened? When that like why is that something that doesn't happen like anymore? Like what exactly could lead to that? And there's no explanation. And usually people they kind of like they understand that, they're very much like, this is my faith, this is what I believe that happened, so I believe that this is possible through God and all that. But it's not really something that happens. So like I kind of like struggle to believe in what's being said. I do accept that like for example these holy texts that we have, like they are very poetic in nature, even if they're not poems, like they kind of like describe fantastical things that kind of like you could say they're kind of like common and like very commonsensical into like a very specific, very it's not necessarily a flowery way, but in a way that it's kind of like it's very significant, and this is something that I learned a lot of years ago, that's kind of like how this happens. Like these are very mundane situations that would you describe them in a way that make them feel very significant, but all those things like they didn't happen, and I'm not here to fight people who believe that they happen. Like I really don't care. But I have been finding myself in these conversations, in these situations, so like they always like get me reflecting on something. They don't really get me questioning what I think, because as I said, like ultimately it is the examples they're given that they really don't like why I can't believe that they happen, basically. There's not a part of me that is like, this could have happened, but yeah, but like I think it's a good sign that like I'm having these conversations in a very civil way. Like they don't really divulge into fighting or anything. There's no kind of like conflict. It also helps that the people I'm talking to, like they're also pretty reasonable, in the sense that they're not going to kind of like start a fight for whatever. But yeah, but that's kind of like where I am at right now. And I'm having these conversations, and they make me, not necessarily, they don't make me question what I believe in, but they do make me question like how I was at different points in time, when I believed those things. And because it always started, I guess, with a certain disbelief of what I was reading, and I think about it because I'm like, have I ever believed in in anything? And I think that the answer is that yes, I used to believe, particularly when you kind of like brought up in a context in which those things are not very much they're not disputed. Like that is kind of like the truth that is being presented, and you just have to kind of like accept that. And I don't think I've ever been rebellious or anything, at least not towards my parents. I think maybe towards religion. Like I've had a lot of like negative feelings about my that part of my upbringing, and like all of the trauma that it caused me. But ultimately it is not I don't know, like it's one of those things that I feel like I think I might have rebelled against the church, but never with my parents. So it was, and although like they are kind of like emissaries of the church, you could argue, because like what they believe in. But I don't know, like I think that I have kind of like a cynical approach to some things. I'm not like, I wouldn't call myself a cynic, but like there is kind of like there's kind of like an inherent distrust from my part towards like anything and anyone. So like any belief system, any ideology, any idea, any like anything. I don't I feel like I get into it with the idea that you have to prove to me that that's true, and then that is right, and then I can kind of like start believing. While I think some people, they jump into those situations kind of like embracing what is being said, and then they kind of like have that be disproved or contested in some capacity. I think it also kind of like just works also in comparison with like the way I kind of like see things, because you could argue that like I don't give my trust and like or respect to people inherently. Like you have to do something to kind of like earn that from me, and I think that is just how I go about life. Although I will say that I have been changing in that regard, and basically like there's a whole lot of I don't know, of me giving people the benefit of the doubt, which is pretty good. Like I haven't really gone to the other extreme, and I don't want to move here to be a gullible person. But so far I think as I said, like I'm giving people the benefit of the doubt. I'm taking a leap of faith with people, and I'm still very hesitant, but I'm allowing myself to trust a little bit more. And that is kind of like something that I think it affects like my life as a whole, and also it shows growth, because I think that for so long I thought that like moving around the world very distrustful of people was kind of like the right way of approaching things. But I think you end up missing a lot of things. You end up losing like you kind of like you miss opportunities that that you would have had if you kind of like you were a little bit more open-minded, a little bit more open to kind of like changes and possibilities and people and all that. But that was kind of like the thing. Oh yeah, also kind of like moving on. Something that I've been thinking a lot too is about fear. I think in my last video I was talking about how I don't want to live in fear. I'm kind of like done with that, and I will say that it does seem like I am making progress in that front. For example, politics, global politics. Like there are things happening, and I kind of like didn't like, and I'm seeing them, and that they didn't faze me. Because ultimately what is going to happen will happen, and naturally I don't want to be cavalier about people's lives or anything, but I did have news, and they didn't make me feel kind of like they were not so insurmountable that I couldn't move on, I couldn't focus on other things. Much to the contrary, I am at a point where it really does seem like I can kind of like withstand more. I can hear more bad things, I have more bad takes, and it doesn't affect me so much. Naturally, as I mentioned before, I'm in a really good stable place right now, so it's easier for me to do that. But you have to consider that I don't know, I think that I'm kind of like developing a habit. So even when I'm kind of down, I think that things are going to be easier and better for me. And I'm very much aware that, like this level of self-awareness that is required for you to kind of like, overlook certain things. Not overlook as in like you're ignoring them, but like you're not letting your body have the response, the reaction that you would have had otherwise. And that is, yeah, so like it's also because, for example, something that my parents brought to my attention the other day is that basically, for example, I was thinking about, elections and, the potential of like a bad person being kind of, elected. And I was thinking about like, a few years ago where like a bad person was elected, and how ultimately like lots of things, I think like my daily life didn't change. And I think that that is a valid point, because like that was definitely something that was upsetting me, but like nowhere as much, nowhere as much as, like later on. Because, for example, like I'm thinking about 2019 as opposed to 2022, where, last time we had elections, and how like I was so affected by everything. And even 2 years ago, when we had the elections for, mayor and all that, I kind of like was already very much affected by those two. And how right now, I think that this year I'm making progress. And also, like, I think that the reason in 2019 why it didn't affect me as much is because I had like so much going on in my head. There was so much trauma that I had to handle, that I had to address, that I was very involved in my own head. So I wasn't hitting too much, the external world. And, by 2022, I had already started like the therapy to deal with my traumas. So I was a little freer to kind of like move about the world and see things as they were happening. While right now, and it was kind of like the same for, but it was kind of like also true for 2014, but it was still kind of like really, I don't know, man. What I'm trying to say is that regardless of what happened, I will be okay. And that is kind of like a mantra I have to live by. Like I have to kind of like stand, by this notion that it doesn't matter what happens, I will be okay. Things are going to be okay, even if they're not, even if like things get bad, like there is still hope for the future. There is still like, I don't want to be crushed by, like the things they're bad, the things they're kind of like not working. I want to focus on the things that are going to kind of like bring, like thinking about like the positives, because there's always going to be bad things happening, but there's also always going to be good things happening. And change is possible is what I'm trying to say. And I think that I had a very defeatist attitude for the longest time, very kind of like, I don't know, I think I acted as if only the bad things mattered. It's not that I objectively thought that, it's just that that's how I felt. I really felt that, the bad things, they were dragging me down. And, they were dragging me down like so hard that, the positive things that could pull me up, they weren't enough. It's kind of like I was surrounded by balloons, and like those balloons were not enough to carry me, and it felt that, like those balloons were popping too, and there were things that were popping those balloons. And right now, as I said, I want to have a more balanced, view of the world. So I want, good things and bad things to have kind of like a similar weight. Naturally, like some things, there's a degree to things. So there are some good things, they're excellent, and there's some bad things, they're horrible, they're awful, they're terrible. So naturally, like a small good thing like does not, like measure up with like a terrible, awful thing. But in the same way that, like a small bad thing, it shouldn't, be compared, which is usually what happens. Like a very small bad thing, kind of like it pops up the balloon of something great that is happening. And also, as I said, so I guess like, I don't want to live in fear, and I want to experience hope. Like I don't want, like this foolish, blind type of hopelessness, to be kind of like the norm. But I kind of like, I want to allow myself to think that things are going to get better. And even if they're not, like even if they don't seem to be getting better right now, it doesn't mean that they never will. Because sometimes it feels like we've reached a certain level of development, and we've been kind of like regressing. But but it's also frustrating. People are frustrating. Like there's that quote from, who is it, the one from like Hell is Other People. That is something I've been kind of like thinking about getting. I have like an image already of like what it would be, but it's interesting. Like that would be my first tattoo in French. I have most of my tattoos are in Latin. I have this quote in English because it's from Paradise Lost, and that's the original language. But l'enfer c'est l'autre. That is the quote. And I feel like, like the idea of getting, like, it might seem that I'm reverting back to kind of like being overwhelmed by things and people, but I don't know. I think that there is kind of like this idea that is kind of like present, that what is the worst that can happen? Like who is perpetrating? Things are not inherently good or bad. It's based on the people. You could argue on what the majority of people are like, but even then, like a majority can be like 95%, but it can also be 51%. So yeah, sometimes certain bad things are winning, but sometimes it's just by a very small margin. And I have to attach myself. I don't want to attach myself to like hopeful. I don't want to be hopeful, of things that kind of like are not justified. But when I look around, like there are a lot of like positive things that I can attach myself to, and I'm kind of like working on those. And also sometimes like things that get bad, that they get worse before they get better, because because of people. They need to sometimes like be exposed to bad situations, to kind of like very negative. To kind of like very negative experiences, so they can learn their lesson and change their ways. And I think that, and I think like the frustrating part is that sometimes it really feels like people are not learning, but like that is not my responsibility. Like I will do my part, like if somebody comes in my way, I will kind of like expose what I think is right, what I think is the truth. But it's up to them whether they're gonna hear what I have to say, whether they're gonna take into consideration, or if they're just going to ignore it. And I can't control them. So when I say l'enfer c'est l'autre, I don't mean this in a defeatist way. I don't mean like, okay, there's nothing I can do. I think that is kind of like a starting point. Like people are going to kind of like they can be like the damnation or the salvation of anything, of a society, of an idea, of whatever concept. So like we start from there. Also, I think I mentioned this earlier, it's completely changing the topic, but kind of like in the same vein, because I'm going to be talking about my tattoos. I've been kind of like, approaching the idea of, because I'm making, more, I want more tattoos basically, and I have more ideas, and so far I've been kind of like having this situation. I'm saying I want more, but it's going to be, what I'm going to be aiming for is kind of like having a third tattoo per year, because I have two that I usually get. Historically I've been getting like in January, and then there is like this year I'm going to be doing something different. It's going to be kind of like one I'm gonna get in August and the other one in January, and there are other tattoos that I want to get. And I don't know why right now I chose to. I think the reason why I'm kind of like, I have to get them right now is because I'm only getting older. So like my skin at a certain point is going to kind of like stop having the same like being the way that it is, because I don't know, will I be getting a tattoo when I'm 60? Probably, but like I don't know, I don't know, man. Like I'm just trying to convince my dad to kind of like be okay with me getting more than 2 tattoos a year. And I'm kind of like making I don't know, like my savings are working out pretty great. So far I have been able to, I've been finding like a really good balance of like allowing myself to enjoy things like in the present, but also saving for the future, which is kind of like all that I need. Because I don't know, like I think I don't want to, it's not that like life is set out in a way that is immutable, like no, you can always change. But I don't know, I think that I have a good idea of where I will be a decade from now, and it works for me. And it is interesting because I don't know, I hope to be making better choices, but it's interesting how sometimes the reason why you make a bad choice, you do something that you're not supposed to, something that isn't good for you, is because you're kind of like deprived of that. So for example, really clear example, for example, drinking. I grew up in a house where there was never any alcohol, there was never nothing. Most of my extended family doesn't drink anything, and the ones who drink is usually kind of like wine. They're like having those experiences, and I basically, so like I didn't really have access to it. So when I was, for example, in high school and everybody was drinking, I didn't really have access to those experiences, because I was also like not going to parties or anything. And what happened is that once I turned 18, once I started kind of like, I had an income a few years after I turned 18, because when I was 18 I was mostly selling stuff, so I didn't have like enough money of my own to kind of like do things. But it was very much I don't know, I was very much it was kind of like, it's because when I look back I feel like I could have like done more I did have access to things, but I think because of like this upbringing that I had, like I wasn't really thinking about it. But then at a certain point, when I started my internship, I was what, 21, 22. I started to kind of like I started drinking. Like I was gonna say more, but like I basically started drinking. I was trying things, and it was a very curious situation. I was kind of like being moved by curiosity. So like I would like order different drinks to see kind of like what they were. And I mean, I shouldn't be drinking, and I ended up stop drinking. Like eventually, like after a couple of years, because it's not good for my head. Because I'm bipolar and all of that. But I think that because maybe like I was deprived of that earlier, I kind of was. I don't know. I think I might have exaggerated at certain points. I might have done too much. And that's kind of like the situation. So I think the point is that because I was kind of like deprived of that, when I finally had access to it, like there were a couple of situations that were kind of like, I wouldn't call them mistakes, but like if I had access to things, like I wouldn't have necessarily pushed myself so hard. And I think the reason I'm thinking is because my brother turned 18, and it's interesting because like I don't know, it gets me thinking, like, cause if I had kind of like asked my parents, to drink, you could argue that like I was an adult, so I was, I could do whatever I want. But like there is an element of like living together that you want kind of like. I don't know, you kind of like want to maintain the peace, like that's important. But right now, like he's drinking sometimes, and my parents are kind of like very little. I mean, he's drinking more than very little, but like my parents allowing him to kind of like drink a little bit more. And it got me thinking, like if I had kind of like asked that, like I know I think they probably would not have been as okay. And I think that it comes from like I am my mom's first child, and my dad's second. But like my older brother, always lived with his mom. So in a certain way, I was kind of like the firstborn, and I think there are things that, for example, they do that kind of like the way they handle my brother a lot of the time. Like I think they're doing a much better job than they would with me when I was younger. And for once, I'm not resentful of that, because when I was younger, I would look at that and I'd be like, well, I didn't have access to that. I couldn't do that. But right now, I'm like, nah. Because I know that they came from a place of love and caring, and also like it's good that they have changed in some ways. Like I think they have a better perspective. They have like maybe not a better perspective, but like a different perspective from like from what like used to be. And so yes, I'm happy for my brother because like they kind of like handling some things. They have more knowledge now. So for example, my brother's ADHD. To be fair, like both my parents have ADHD, so I think the way that they have handled me having ADHD has always been pretty kind of like much better than a lot of like it would have been with like neurotypical parents with a neurodivergent child. So like I think that in that way, like they never fucked up. And they always kind of like help me, kind of like because I'll be very frustrated, for example, with my grades when I was in school. I mean, technically I'm still in school, when I was like in middle school, high school. And it was interesting that they would have like they kind of like had an approach of like, okay, let me just because I was already pretty harsh on myself. Like they were kind of like embracing me and being like, it's okay, and things are going to be all right. And for once I can kind of like see that. I think because right now I'm like studying something that I'm like I can see a future in. I can look back and be like, that was a part of my journey. Like I had to go through these experiences so I could get to the other side and like be healthy and happy. So I look back right now at all the different things that I tried, and I don't really have any level of resentment. I think I'm finally at a point where I'm like, yeah, it's going to be okay. You're gonna figure yourself out. You're gonna find your way. And this is something that my parents have always like believed in. They always kind of like passed this down to me. Although there were many points in time where I didn't really believe that. I really felt like it was kind of like a hopeless situation. And so that's pretty much it. Like they have always supported me in a way that which I think came from understanding. It came from like them knowing how things were for them when they were growing up, and they were doing better with their children. So that is pretty positive. So I only have positive things to say for my parents regarding this, and not for them in general. Like I feel like like their biggest crimes were more like being convent, is that a word, being kind of like compliant with, for example, things that were imposed to me at church. Like I feel like a lot of like my pain comes from that. And they might not have said some things, but they kind of like endorsed the people who were saying those things. So there's that. And it is interesting because For example, yesterday I was talking to my mom about an experience we had. So back in the day, McDonald's, they had this game. It was a city game, and then there was a blue one and a green one. And maybe there were more, but like I remember these two. And my mom, she played with me. I mean, I say she played with me, but it was mostly like her playing and me struggling because I was a child and I didn't really have the coordination, the motor skills to kind of like do a good job. But it was a really fun game, and we spent a lot of time playing it. And that is, was one of my most formative memories, from like when I'm thinking about like our experiences. And as I said, like right now, particularly now that I dealt with my trauma, when I look back, my experiences are overwhelmingly positive, and I think this makes a huge difference because even when I have been kind of like floating around like a plastic bag without knowing what to do, I knew that I had the support, and like they were there for me. And this makes a huge difference, in the life of somebody. I think that I had my own, for example, my mental illness, I had my own experiences with that, and they were very negative. They led to like a lot of like mistakes being made. But I think the fact that like my family life, my home life was pretty stable, it really helped. Like I think that I never really reached as awful, and as I could have, and that is kind of like something to kind of like be celebrated. I think that if I didn't have my parents' support, like things would have been much more traumatic, and it would have been much worse because in a lot of ways I wasn't really lacking. I think that when it comes to my social life, I was probably lacking like a lot of that. By it's my choice to kind of like remove myself from the situation, and I'm only now kind of like getting back to it. But it is kind of like worth saying, worth pointing out that I think there wasn't as much of a deficit because I had a very healthy life with my parents. And of course, like right now we're kind of like the healthiest we've ever been because I did start to push people away, including them, when I had like the trauma when I was 13. So like not everything was ideal. Life happens sometimes in terrible ways, and I was kind of like a victim of like different things, being kind of like at the wrong place at the wrong time, or sometimes it was the right place but it was the wrong time. It was the wrong place but the right time. I don't know how that one would work, but the point I'm trying to make is that so like things were said, things were done that were not ideal, but thankfully like right now I can look back and think mostly of like the positive things. And also I think it comes from like you understanding that your parents are fallible beings, like they're human, they're going to make mistakes, but they love you, like they're doing what they think is best for you. And as I said, like right now I can look back and be like, sometimes what they thought was best was not really good, it really affected me negatively, but I can at least look back and be like, they thought that this is pretty much what they had to do. They thought that was the right path. And I have nothing but, I guess like, there's never been any malice, basically. There's never been kind of like any ill will. And that counts for something. It's interesting because like now that counts, but for so long it kind of didn't, like because it's the thing that the people say, like the road to heaven, to hell is paved with good intentions. So sometimes like just meaning well doesn't really do anything, particularly because what you can do is going to be very negative and it's going to impact you in a very kind of like significant way. But yes, but like I think that I am starting to take more into account what people they mean to do instead of like what they say, what they do, what they mean to say. And that just shows that I think maturity from my part. I'm finally at a point where I can kind of look at things and kind of like separate the person from like the words, the deeds, because as I said, like like they mean well. I was thinking about this woman who was kind of like a family friend, friend of my mom, and like back when I had Instagram, she one time posted something very hurtful, very like yeah, something really bad. I had like there's no excuse for what she said, and it did have to do with a group that I'm a part of. So it was something that really created like really kind of like made me see her differently. And but like right now these days I'm thinking about it and it doesn't hurt anymore. I'm kind of like doing very well. But also something to consider is that I kind of like I see how because that's the thing about religion. Like religion is always going to be huge for me because of the way I was brought up. It was part of like my upbringing. And but yeah, like but I think a lot of times people, they say and they do things because they believe that be the best for you. They believe you have to behave a certain way because that's kind of like how you're going to be saved. And if you do something different, you might go to hell or whatever. So I'm trying to kind of like separate that. So for example, my aunt, I'm gonna say the other day, but it's probably been months now. We're talking to her about sexuality, sexual orientation, all that, because my cousin, her daughter, she's queer and she has a girlfriend, and I'm also queer, and I don't have a partner. I don't really intend to, but like that is part of it. And both my brothers are also queer, so like it's such a very like it's kind of like my dad's side of the family very queer, and it's something that it does make me feel like that is something good, because I feel like, because when I look at, for example, my mom's side of the family, me and my brother, we are kind of like the rainbow shape, but my dad's side, there is like one cousin who is not, apparently, so like everybody else is. So it does make me think that it's genetic and it's from my dad's side. That's pretty much where I got it from. And it does make me wonder, like, does my mom kind of like blame my dad? I mean, right now we're at a different height, but like when I was younger, did my mom blame my dad? Was that a dynamic to their relationship? I have no idea, but I do think about this, particularly because like this is an interesting concept that I want to explore in writing. It doesn't necessarily have to be to do with sexual orientation, but the point I'm trying to make is that I was talking to my aunt, and she said a lot of things that were very hurtful, and like pretty much how she sees things, and the things, how she approaches the situation. And it's one of those things that at the time I was already kind of like doing better. We didn't kind of like get into a fight or anything. I was just listening, but like being very sad that she thought that way. And it was kind of like an interesting but yeah, the point I'm trying to make is that I look back at her, and right now I can kind of like separate her from her speech. Maybe she's going to change her mind one day, maybe she never will, but at least like we're doing much better, because she's not forbidding like her daughter from seeing her girlfriend or anything. They still kind of like have a lot of like hesitations, like apprehensions, about the whole thing, but it could be worse. Basically, I think that is kind of like the thing, like looking at the glass half full type of way, because people, you have to meet people where they are at. It's kind of like the lesson also that I had, because even people don't mean anything by what the things they're saying, they still have they still informing their decisions, and that can be frustrating. Like how, because some things are so immutable, and I think religion also has a lot of that, because people, they kind of like sometimes they're very much stuck in their ways because of religion. If like something were to happen, if like they were not involved in religion, they might change their minds, they might kind of like have a different approach. But as it is, like they're kind of stuck there. And I'm not saying this that I'm not saying you should have sympathy for them and in their state, but I think these days, anything I kind of like perceived, I've been kind of like, oh, I can kind of like explore this in my writing, and it's very exciting, because I think that when I do that, I'm able to kind of like disarm the situation, like, so instead of being the sticking time bomb, like suddenly I'm disarming it. But the point is that I was trying to say is that I was talking to my aunt, and I was real sad, but like right now I'm thinking about this, and it doesn't make me sad anymore. It's still kind of like fucked up, what she thinks, and does, but I don't know, I think I'll be able to separate, so much so that I'm going to get a matching tattoo with her. So like that is, I think you would say that is a big victory for me, that to be able to separate, because the thing that people say, separating the art from the artist, I don't think that is possible, entirely possible. Also, it depends, because like there are certain things they're kind of like inexcusable. So like I won't consume the art from a person who says that, does that, has that stance. But there are some things that you can kind of like overlook. There are things that, and it's kind of like hard, because like and it's also like this whole notion that we have to have that bad people can make good art, and that is kind of like something that we have to conciliate. I don't think that you should completely separate the art from the artist, particularly because art is always going to be, they're always going to have like a point, a stance. It's always going to be political, as much as people want to separate it from the author's politics. So it's kind of hard sometimes for you to just completely overlook like the situation, but as I said, like there are degrees to things. So like there are some things that we can forgive, particularly like if it is something that like the artist like has sought forgiveness for, they change their mind in some type of way. And yeah, so kind of like, because this kind of reminds me of something that I've seen kind of like a conversation online. It's probably still there. This is from like way back in the day, when I still had social media, which is the fact that sometimes people are going to equate somebody looking good with like them being, for example, unproblematic. Because sometimes people are going to be unproblematic and they're not going to look good the same way that some people who are problematic, they're going to look good. Like according to society's expectations and standards. That's what I'm saying. So I don't know. I think that there's something very iffy, something very icky about kind of like equating those two. Like, look at how problematic people age and all that. And it's interesting because I remember seeing that for the first time. It was like, oh, I never really thought about this. And it's right. I think that sometimes we kind of like regressing, because when you think about way back in the day, like there was this correlation between beauty and goodness. So like that was something very like it was kind of like a problematic thing that people, a notion that people inherited. And I think we've been moving away from that, but sometimes it feels like we're going back to that idea. So it's an interesting thing, kind of like the cyclical nature of things. And I was the other day, like I was brought back, like the beginning of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And it's interesting because like that is something that is, you could apply that to any point in time and would be kind of like prevalent, because that is kind of like how things work. At any point in time, there's going to be a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. People are going to be struggling, people are going to be thriving, and it depends on like a lot of different factors. So like that's just something that was in my head. I was like, oh yeah, like and it kind of like helps me in terms of like me kind of like processing things better, and not being as affected by some negative things. Just kind of like look at things and be like, yeah, it is the worst of times, it's the best of times. It is all of those things simultaneously, and it depends on who you ask. And it's interesting because this is kind of like how it's always going to be the case. I was talking about tattoos, and I was like, how do I get a tattoo that is kind of, because I don't like, I just the quote, but like that is something kind of like encapsulates this notion. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's always going to be great, it's always going to be bad. I think there's also this moment I'm living in which like everything is pretty great, like everything is working out for me in every single area of my life. Is much easier for me to kind of like accept that yes, the world is kind of like falling apart, but it's been falling apart since always. It's also another thing that kind of like gets me this notion is people talking about the youth. Like if you get something from the 1800s, there's going to be complaints. But 1900s, complaints. 1800s, complaints. 1700s, complaints. So back and so forth. Because this is kind of like just how the nature of change. Times change, and whoever had lived a different time is going to be nostalgic about that, and it's going to kind of like try to invalidate whatever's happening. So I think like keeping that in mind is very helpful in this sense, because I'm like, okay, so things are awful, people are complaining, but people have always been complaining, and things have always been bad, but they have also always been good to some extent to some people. I think like that is kind of like the key word here, because it is good for some people, but for a lot of people it is not. So like, what can we do to try to kind of like rectify that situation? And a lot of people, they're not going to be interested. And I think this is kind of like the thing that bothers me the most, like in the situation. It's kind of like, it's not just like bad things happening, but people being willing to learn from their mistakes, and also to learn how to live in a society and caring about their neighbors. So much so that like the second commandment, from the one from Moses, to kind of like love your neighbor as you love yourself. And Jesus later said that God above all, and like loving your neighbors, like those are the important ones. And I was thinking about maybe again like love your neighbor as yourself. Tattoo, as I said, like a lot of like things are happening, and I'm thinking I have a lot of ideas for tattoos, and they're all very relevant, because my tattoos, they're kind of like they signify something that I believe in, something that I've learned, something. They kind of like they encapsulate a moment in my life, and I'm in a moment where I'm learning a lot of things. So I think my head is just kind of like running wild. But because the whole thing of like loving your neighbor, like the golden rule, treat others as like you want to be treated, like all versions of like that notion, I'm trying to embrace them right now. I'm trying to be less self-involved and less selfish, and and not only in my actions but in my thoughts as well. It's the thing that Jesus said, like if you think you love your brother, it's like you're murdering them. So yeah. So basically, I'm kind of like trying to kind of like apply this notion to situations in my life. I want to, like even somebody who's trying to like who wishes me ill, somebody who kind of like wants me to not succeed, not do well in life. They want to change me, transform me, from who I am into kind of like whatever version they see that will be ideal. And basically, I want to. It's not that I want to be kind to those people. I mean, if I could be kind to them, like it would be pretty great because it would really show that I have healed and that I am just living my life without being bothered by things that I cannot control. But that is, something that I don't know, like it really does. It kind of like it really does mean something, like that I'm trying. And even if I'm not fully succeeding at first, trying is half the battle. Like trying, willingness to try. I think that is, was kind of like half the battle. Just me being like, you know what, I'm trying to kind of like find common ground, like in these situations, and I'm trying to be kinder, but as I said, like not in my actions, because like in my actions, I've always been kind of kind. I'm kind of like I respect people. At least I'm civil with people. I'm never really. I mean, I did have my moments of aggression, but apart from like them, I'm mostly kind of like I'm behaving. If I can't really, for example, say something nice, the thing of I don't say anything, or I remove myself from the situation. But what I want now is to just kind of like go freely, because by isolating myself, I'm also limiting my possibilities. I'm kind of like preventing myself from kind of like experiencing life to the fullest. So I want to go about the world without fearing, without walking on eggshells, without fearing that something's going to trigger my traumas, my that would trigger like a very intense response. So I right now, like where I am at is that I kind of want, yes, like I want to be kinder to people. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, as I already said. And this kind of like, and this can go very well, and yeah, it can also go very badly. But I do think that there's a learning curve. Like I'm going to keep trying until I'm kind of like at a point where I'm free. Because that's the thing, I don't want to have fear. Naturally, like things happen that make you scared, make you afraid. But what I want, for myself, in the future is to not live in fear of the things that I cannot control. I don't want to be affected. I don't want to be kind of like, because that's the problem. When I say affected, it seems to be such a light word to describe the overwhelming negative feeling. It's kind of like very heavy cloud just dragging me down, just pushing me down. Like, so I don't want that shit anymore. I want to, I don't want to live in fear. And that is going to be freedom, because ultimately freedom is very important to me. Freedom, independence, autonomy, however you want to put it, like all those things, they have always kind of like been something that I valued. I think after my trauma, when I was 13, like that was, something that really kind of like became more highlighted. It really, yeah, it became more evident, that it was important. But even before that, I was like, I always valued my ability to move freely around the world, and I was a very outgoing person, and I think I'm returning to that version of myself. But it's going to be a journey. It's going to take time, and I'm ready to wait. I'm ready to, but I have to try, because it's not just waiting for things to improve. Like you have to make changes. You have to kind of like try different things. And as I said, like not every attempt is going to be a success, but like ultimately, you have to keep trying. Like even if you don't don't have like a concrete strategy of what you can do, like you have to kind of like persist. So I want fearlessness, I want resilience, I want freedom. All of them are kind of like different ways of saying the same thing, but it's important for me to kind of like to really highlight this, that this is kind of like what I want. I don't want to live in fear anymore, because fear of like things I can change, and of things getting worse, because things sometimes they get worse before they get better, sometimes they get better before they get worse, and that's just like the nature of life. We're kind of like stuck in this cycle. It's a circle, where like the reason I say a circle and not like a triangle, because it's like there are many points around it, but it's not as, because I feel like, for example, a triangle will be kind of like, there's an angle here, so this would be a point, and this would be a point, this would be a point, and it's kind of like very marked. But like those things, they kind of like change. I don't know if this metaphor worked, but we're kind of like in the cycle of things getting better, things getting worse. Of course, that like I would love to live in a world where we only made progress and there was no regress, but like you have so many different people involved in things, so that is kind of like always going to happen to some extent. but yeah, so I think that's it for today. I hope that I got enough stuff out of my head so I can go back and start writing, because as I mentioned before, I have about 40 pages to go, and I would like to make, if I could do half of that today, it would be very helpful. It would be very productive. It would be pretty good for me, and you kind of like, because if I do 20 pages, okay, maybe 10 pages. I have to be no, but today I don't have swimming class, so I will like I'll have like my Zumba class at 6 p.m. But yeah, but that is kind of like what. That's kind of like it for today. So yeah, anyways, bye.